Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Daily Devotional. Our Daily Devotional today is coming from Job. We're probably, I assume we're all familiar with Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, where Job, all at once, it seems, he loses his children, he loses his livestock, his livelihood. Chapter 2, his wife turns on him, and eventually he loses his health. He gets boils all over his body. His wife turns on him. His friends turn on him. All of them are convinced that he had done something wrong, that God was punishing him. And the thought process was that, and in many ways still remains today among some people, that when anything bad happens in your life, it's God punishing you. And Job in chapter 1 and chapter 2 said, I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't done anything that God would punish. In fact, Job, after all of the initial things happen in chapter 1, he falls to his knees. He praises God. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. In chapter 2, when his wife tells him to curse God and die, because obviously your God isn't worth serving if he's going to treat you this way, Job says, you speak as the foolish women speak. Shall we accept good from the Lord, but not accept adversity? And it even notes there in Job chapter 2 at the end of the chapter that in all this, Job did not sin with his mouth, with his lips, to curse God or to rail against God or anything else. As things progress from chapters 3 on through chapter 34 and 35, we have Job's friends who attempt to convince Job that he's in sin. Over the course of that dialogue, Job responds to his friends, but at the same time, there are several times in which he calls upon God. God, it would have been better if I had never been born. He's in such agony and in such despair that he would have wished he'd never been born. But then, as he progresses into the 30, 31, and 32, before Elihu starts speaking, Job begins to not question God's power. He doesn't question God's right to allow these things to happen. He questions God's wisdom. Is it wise, God, to allow righteous people to suffer in this way? Will this not cause other people to mock the righteous? Your God can't take care of you. Your God doesn't like you. Or as Job's friends had been doing, obviously you've done something wrong. And so Job began to question God's wisdom. And the Lord answers Job here in chapter 38. And we're not going to read 38, 39, 40, and 41, but there are some highlights I want to point out. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Which is to say, you're muddying up your own understanding by talking about things you know nothing about. Now prepare yourself like a man, I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Who shut in the seas with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? Then he talks about the clouds. He talks about creation, ultimately, here in chapter 38. But then we go to chapter 39. And God says, he again describes more about creation, but he talks specifically about the animals and the things that he had created, the mountains, the wild ox. He talks about this is about, can you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes? Will he plow the valleys behind you? Will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? Will you trust him to bring home your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly storks? For she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. It goes on to describe these laws that he has placed not only in nature but also in animals. And then in chapter 40, moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. So then the Lord speaks again to Job, and the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, or can you thunder with a voice like his? God talks about himself and the power that he has and the authority that he has and his wisdom. And in verse 15, look at the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. And he talks about how majestically this behemoth has been created. And then in chapter 41, we talk about Leviathan. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? And all the way through this, God is reminding Job that it is my wisdom that has brought all of this about. And in chapter 42, Job responds to God. Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything. And Jehovah has gone through a lot of the things that he had done, brought up kind of rhetorically. Do you know how this was done? Do you know how I created the ostrich and the behemoth and Leviathan and so forth? I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me which I did not know. Remember, we looked at that God, he asks that back in chapter 38. Who is this who hides counsel or darkens counsel without knowledge? And Job was saying things and talking about things that he didn't really understand. And to question the wisdom of God, is it wise to allow a righteous person to suffer in this way? That brings about, well, surely, Job, then you know my wisdom. You must have all of this knowledge and all of this understanding, and so you should be able to respond to me. Well, Job can't respond, obviously. None of us could. And so this is why Job comes to the conclusion that he does. He says, therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. The wisdom that you have, the power, the majesty that you have to create the things that you've created and to allow things to progress in nature as you have. These are things that I do not know, I cannot know, things that are too wonderful for me to know. And in verse 4, Job says, listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now, as far as we know, as of this moment, okay, Job, at least at some point in this process, as of verse 6, he still has the boils. And we're not told at any point before this that the boils had been taken away or that anything had been restored to him. That doesn't happen till later in chapter 42. So Job has kind of had this realization. He says, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. I don't think Job's speaking literally. I don't think he was literally seeing God. I think this is a metaphor to describe that I knew the words, but I didn't have a full understanding of the vastness of your wisdom, of the vastness of your power, the majesty that you possess and that you command. That it's one thing to know it, It's another thing to understand it. And while he had heard of God and certainly got the word of God by the hearing of his ear, now there's a dawning of understanding. Now there's a realization, a light bulb, we might say, that has gone off in Job for him to realize that none of this stuff is for me to know. And I have no right to question, and I don't believe that Job ever questioned God's right to do anything, or that he questioned God's ability to do anything. He questioned God's wisdom. And Job realized, I have no right to even question his wisdom. And of course, the important thing to realize in all of this, that again, not only has, as far as we know as of verse 6, Job not been, the boils not been taken away from him yet. So he's still in this agony. But we also, as far as we're told, in fact, even through the end of chapter 42 here, God never explains to Job, here's why these things happened. We know, going back to chapter 1 and chapter 2, that the devil had challenged God and said, the only reason Job is faithful to you is because all the things in his life are good. And as soon as you start taking or allow those things, in this case, to be taken away, then he won't be faithful to you anymore. And Job said, all right. And so, or God says, all right, well, I'll allow you to do this. And then chapter 1, obviously, he wasn't allowed to touch Job physically, but he took his children, he took his livelihood, his servants, and so forth. Then in chapter 2, Job said, well, let me take his health also. So God allowed him to take his health. But we know that. As far as we know, Job didn't know that. And so what Job is coming to this understanding, this conclusion is in verse 6, or culminating here in verse 6, is that I've realized that I don't need to know why. I realize I should not question your wisdom, because you, and you alone, know why you allow things to happen and why you allow things not to happen. And Job has come to this realization because of God's challenging him here in chapter 38 through 41. Ultimately, it wasn't so much his friends, although Elihu did have some important points to make in chapter, I think it's chapter 36 and 37, that Elihu's speaking. Let me make sure about that. Is it chapter 30, let's see. Oh, well, really, actually, starting all the way back up to chapter 32, Elihu's speaking all the way through here. And then starting in chapter 38, then the Lord answers. So Elihu did have some important points to make, and Elihu had he was fairly accurate in the things that he said. In fact, we'll see that Elihu isn't mentioned here in chapter 42. It's the other three friends that were. But Job recognized his need to trust that God knows best, and that God doesn't owe us answers. Okay, Job questioned God's wisdom. In a lot of ways, you read in between the lines of what Job says, Job's wondering why. Why are you allowing this to happen to me? I'm righteous. I haven't done anything wrong. Why is this happening? And Job's coming to the realization, I don't need to know why. And I realize that it's wrong for me to demand an answer as to why. That it's wrong for me to question your wisdom, that you alone, it's sufficient that you know why these things are happening. And this is why, in verse 47, so it was after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord commanded them, for the Lord had accepted Job. And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Notice Elihu isn't mentioned in this group, which suggests to me that the Lord, at least per what he says here, it seems the Lord accepted Elihu's words. Many of the things Elihu said were very accurate. But Elihu actually kind of spoke against Job's friends. He condemned them. He condemned Job for his thoughts. Elihu seemed to have been on the right track. But his three friends, and his wife, incidentally, all were of the persuasion that if something bad happens in your life, it's because God is punishing you. And what we learn, going all the way back even to Job's time, there's a bunch of lessons here, obviously. But first of all, just because something bad happens to us, that doesn't mean God is punishing us. But when things that happen that are sad, that are what we might call bad, or we wish hadn't happened, or things that we wish had happened that don't, we can wonder, I wonder why this happened the way it did, or why this didn't happen the way I wanted it to. We can speculate, we can kind of maybe extrapolate in our minds, maybe some things that could have happened that God wanted to spare us from. But in the end, and we can pray about it. We can say, God, God, I wonder why. But in the end, we have to acknowledge, God, I don't need to know why. Job had to learn, I don't need to know why. I know I have done those things that are right. I know it's not that you're punishing me for anything I've done wrong. And as a result, I can trust that you know what's best. And that if something happens that causes me sorrow or grief in this life, I know that there's a reason for it. And I trust your wisdom. I trust that you, being in control of all things, know why this is happening. And and the lesson from Job is that no matter what happens in our lives, good or bad, that we should trust God's wisdom. That we should recognize that when things happen, it's not that God's punishing us for something necessarily. It's the fact that things happen in life, and maybe the whole reason God's allowing that thing to happen is to show others a proper example of faith. Maybe that's the whole reason. Maybe there's somebody that God wants to make a point to about, here's what faithful people do, truly faithful people, when things don't go their way. I'm going to allow this to happen to my servant so-and-so, and they're going to be faithful to me despite whatever happens. That's the example of faith that you should look to. Maybe that's the only reason. But regardless, we have Job as a lesson for us. And let me get a little meta with you for a second. Imagine for a moment that the whole reason why God allowed these things to happen to Job, let's say it's the only reason why all of this is recorded for us in the book of Job, is for you and me. Now, I want you to really think about that for a minute. What if all of these terrible events happened to Job so that you and I could look back at Job's example, look back at Job's conclusion, and say to ourselves, you know what? I need to be as Job ended up being, and trust that God knows what he's doing when he allows things to happen. That I should not question his wisdom, that I should not demand an answer why, that I should just simply continue to live faithfully in my life. Now, and I'm not at all saying that is the only reason why this happened to Job, but what if it was? Job never receives, as far as we know, he never receives a reason why these things happened. He's never told that Satan challenged God through Job. Not only that, but God never tells Job, I'm going to let you be an example to generations of believers so that they can learn the very same thing you learn. But it's one of those things where you look back and you say, wow, we look back in our lives at things that may have happened that we wish hadn't happened, things that were outside of our control, sorrowful things, sad things, and we ask ourselves, what did I gain from that? What happened as a result of that? And if we're able to look back in our lives and say, you know what, no matter what happened, no matter what bad thing took place, I remained faithful and I trusted in the Lord, then we are further along than Job was. And that's why, or at least for us now, that's why Job's example is here in the Bible for us. That's the Daily Devotional for you today. Thursday will be our next Daily Devotional at 6:30, Lord willing. I will see you all then. Y'all have a great rest of your evening and good tomorrow, Wednesday, and Lord willing, I'll see you Thursday.